It's question time now. Thanks very much indeed for submitting your questions. We don't have to stick to all of these. If you've got any thoughts you'd like to add or supplementary questions you'd like to ask, just stick your hands up and we'll get you there. So, without further ado, could I just bring our panel up onto the platform? We have, of course, your President, Irene Curtis. Come and join us, Irene. Sara Thornton, who's Chair of the National Police Chief Council. Police Chief Council, Sara, come and join us, please. Thank you very much. Will Riches from the Police Federation. Hi, Will. Good to see you. Alison Phillips, who's editor of the Sunday Mirror. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. And last but by no means least, Mike Cunningham from HMIC. Thank you all very much indeed. I think I'm right in saying, Sara, you're the only one who actually was here to hear the Home Secretary this morning. You weren't here, will you? Will? No. OK, fine. Anyway, so questions from the floor, please. I'm going to call out names. Will you stick out, because I've got the questions here, will you stick your hands up and we'll get a microphone to you as quickly as possible. We're going to kick off with Nora, rather overworked this morning. I'm sorry, Nora, but it's your turn again. Nora, your question for our panel, please. And just remind them who you are.
Good morning, I'm Nora Holford from Thames Valley Police. My question's about policing in austerity. In the current age of austerity, the police service has already risen to significant challenges over the past few years. As a service, it is clear we face further challenges over the next 5 years at least. In order to meet these challenges, it is also clear the way the police service operates and what and how we deliver will need to change. How can we ensure that we effectively engage with the public and the media to ensure this is a positive dialogue and a collaborative development rather than a war of attrition and complaint?
OK, Nora, thanks very much. Sara, do you want to respond to that? Because you were the one who heard what the Home Secretary had to say, and indeed what Irene had to say this morning on this very issue.
Let me deal with Nora's, and then maybe I'll talk about the Home Secretary.
Sure.
Some of you might have read the editorial in the Telegraph last Thursday, which talked about the need for a Royal Commission. And unusually, I agreed with most of what that editorial had to say, except for the point that it made about the fact that there were stories, deliberate shroud-waving, calculated to alarm the public. And I don't think that's what chiefs have been trying to do at all. I think what they've been trying to do is what the Home Secretary was talking about this morning, about having a frank conversation. Because the very last thing we want to do is to alarm the public. And we've thought very hard about what we should say. Because I agree with you entirely that actually the impact of the cuts will be felt by the public. So I think it's a really difficult area. We do agonise about what we should say, and I think the point that the Telegraph was making, that if there isn't this discussion, it risks undermining what is a very valuable and valued brand of policing and respected throughout the world. So I do think that that's important, and we've tried very hard to avoid shroud waving. In terms of what the Home Secretary had to say, and John kindly said he might ask me this. I mean, I thought a lot of what she said was the usual sorts of messages in terms of past achievements and future challenges. I thought from your perspective as superintendents, the appreciation that she showed for your contribution, and for Irene's in particular, which I would endorse, is something that you should take heart from. I think she was very positive about you, your rank and the contribution. But in terms of, I guess, concerns, 3 issues. One is the point about austerity. She talked about a frank conversation. I think a frank conversation has got to include the fact that there will be fewer officers and staff, significantly fewer. And actually, we can't expect a lot less staff, a lot fewer people to do exactly the same. And we do need to think about new ways of delivering policing. Some of that's about evidence-based practice, being quite clear that some things we've done for a long time, if the evidence is not there that they work, then we do need to have that debate. So up for the frank debate, but it requires, I think, some political courage. The second point, and I get her point about amalgamations, because if I was the Home Secretary, I can see it's fraught with risk, political risk. And the point she makes about local accountability is not to be underestimated. The difficulty is, and I think the colleague who made the point about piecemeal approaches to collaboration is absolutely right. We are pursuing collaboration. You know, the latest HMIC report said there was lots and lots of it going on, which is great. But it is piecemeal. And we in a constant debate, as has Irene and Gavin, with the Home Office saying, please, you need to take much more of a convening role because we need some political leadership here. Because it's not just us as chiefs, it's not just the supers or the feds, it's also the police and crime commissioners, it's about the Home Office. Can you please play more of a role? If we're to really deliver the layering work she talked about, which I think is a good idea, worth developing, but we need the Home Office at the table for that. And the last point, and really interesting questions from Simon Evans on stop and search, and I thought made his point very well. What I thought was interesting for us, did you hear what the Home Secretary said? Not so much about stop and search, but about the culture of policing. She said that she often gets frustrated that we do all of this or all of that, and we can't get the balance. And I've heard her make that comment about targets. That, you know, the previous government said that acquisitive crime was important, therefore you didn't deal with sexual abuse. You can either do one thing or the other, but you can't get that balance. And there's a part of me which thinks, yes, but you are the Home Secretary, and we have a lot of staff who are desperately wanting to be compliant and do the right thing, and they hear the main point. So in terms of stop and search, officers have heard the first point she made is, this is a barrier to relationships with the community. They hear that, therefore they do less of it. Now, I think there's something about messaging for the Home Secretary, but I do think there is something about our culture and how we encourage a greater degree of professional self-confidence, that people can have that balance, that they don't see it as black and white, all or nothing, binary, that actually we have the knowledge, the evidence base to take a more measured response.
All right, well, you weren't here, but I've got the guts of it from what Sara's just said. I mean, she was saying, yes, cuts there will be, and the answer is more her answer was more collaboration between forces, etc., do the same job now for less, basically. Your gut reaction to all that?
Well, we've listening to the comments, and I wasn't here for the Home Secretary's speech. Stop and search is an interesting one. There was some interest on social media yesterday about that, actually, and a comment that really resonated with me was, what would you rather us have our hands in? Your child's chest cavity or their pocket? Because actually, you know, it's a preventative measure. It's about actually trying to prevent crime, detect crime, and stop people from getting injured. So it's an interesting one that often gets wheeled out. But going back to Nora's question, which was about how do we achieve this sort of media engagement, that's the age-old question. It's so difficult. But actually, you know, and you talked about Shadwavy, we talk a lot about honesty and integrity, and our job is to be the representatives of truth. And the way I think that we will achieve greater trust with the public is by earning it. I certainly don't think we'll earn it by sort of hiding the true picture of what policing really looks like. We've long said as a federation the 43-force model is not sustainable in the current climate, and certainly in the face of further cuts. That is something that has to be looked at. The Royal Commission is something that's been talked about for a very, very long time, but what we have to do is remind, I think, those making the decisions about their need to be honest as well, and actually ask the public what they want from the police service, what they are prepared for us to deliver, what they are prepared for us not to be able to deliver anymore. Be honest, be open, talk about it, let's have a proper holistic consultation and work out how we can deliver a decent service of policing for the public.
When you can see that there have been occasions when you've cried wolf, as she alleges?
Well, it's interesting. But our job is to actually represent the truth. Our members would not thank us for pretending things aren't difficult when they are. But I think it's fair to say as well that everybody in this room, everybody who works in policing is doing their level best to make sure we still continue to deliver a reasonable service.
Mike, to go back to Nora's question, how are you going to deliver, how are you going to maintain some sensible dialogue and not be accused of crying wolf, etc.? How can the force do that? How can the force best do that? And what would you like them to do?
The audience will be aware that HMIC have recently concluded our efficiency inspections. We've been looking at forces and how they have dealt with austerity over the past 5 years and what their plans are for forthcoming years. And I will say very clearly that forces have dealt well with the challenges over the past 5 years, and that is credit to the leadership of the service. I think that what is coming requires a new type of radical thinking. And that radical thinking is out there, but it is not all pervasive at the moment. Forces are at different places in terms of their ability to comprehend what's possible around the delivery of community safety under very, very different financial arrangements. So radical thinking is required. That's the first point. Going specifically to Nora's question about engaging communities, clearly, and I think it was implicit in your question, Nora, that getting messages out there simply isn't enough. What you were talking about is how do you actually communicate with communities in a different way. And I think, again, forces with different degrees of imagination are undertaking ways in which they can get messages out there. I would just perhaps focus on one point, and that is that I think that it is helpful when that engagement is consistent at all levels of leadership within a particular police force. It is not helpful if there is a message which is delivered from chief officers which is nuanced or different and delivered at the tier of leadership that's represented in this room down to a tier of leadership at sergeant or team leader level. So I think the real challenge for leadership in the service at the moment is to make sure that there is a cohesive, coordinated, easily understood a narrative around this that people can use when they're engaging with communities.
And you can be helped in that by the media, of course. Alison, do you want to help in this regard? I mean, what's the Sunday Mirror's position on the message about police services in this country for the next 5 years?
Well, I think it's interesting generally how little attention actually this whole topic has received. I mean, and there you say that there was a Telegraph leader last week which was actually saying that you were all sabre-rattling on the topic, whereas in actual fact that the reality is the cuts are extraordinary, they're huge, and it's clearly indicative of how relations have broken down between the police and the press over recent years for all those reasons that we're all horribly aware of. But in the run-up to the election, obviously health's always going to get a huge amount of attention. Cuts to local authorities, elderly people, those services, they're always going to get a lot of attention, but I'm staggered how little attention that there was to the cuts in the police.
Well, you're partly responsible.
We are partly responsible, but it's like a breakdown of any relationship. It's on both sides, isn't it? And if you want to try and heal that relationship, both sides have to try and mend it, which is sort of why I'm here now. And I know there's quite often been a big emphasis about, oh, we're now getting our messages out on Twitter and social media, and we don't need the traditional print press. I think everyone needs to take a long, hard look at the realities of a lot of social media. I mean, in this country, I think the numbers of people actually on Twitter is now slightly lower than 2%. If you want to talk to the normal people that are using your services and are meeting your PCs on the ground every day, you need to be in the local newspaper. You need to be in the national newspapers. You need to be in the tabloids. You need to be where your customers are reading. And I think if we can try to rebuild, and I'm not blaming the police at all, someone's got very good relationships, some are even married to police officers, as I am. But if we want to rebuild those relationships, we've from both sides got to start giving a bit more.
Irene, final word, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah. I think the points that have been made are very valid, and that engagement with the public is really difficult. If you think of the cases in the last few weeks where chief officers and others have talked about how we might have to police differently. Sara's interview on the Victoria Derbyshire show is a good example, where she was trying to start to have that conversation with the public about how policing might need to change, and it just ended up getting totally twisted and became a very, very different conversation on social media and in the media that ended up having to be defended almost, when actually all we're trying to do is open up that debate with the public about the impact of the cuts on policing. The other example is the Leicestershire pilot around scenes of crime attendance at attempted burglaries, and that's really helpful. I find it interesting the comments you make, Alison, about this broken down relationship with the media, because I've not fallen out with the media at all.
No.
But I can't engage with the media, even through our comms advisor. We find it really difficult to get the media's attention. This conference, for example, we've done an interview with the Independent for the Independent on Sunday. That didn't appear. We're constantly, in the lead up to the general election, we finally got a slot on BBC Breakfast, but it was a very, very small slot, and despite all the pushing we do, this just isn't on the agenda. Now, some of that's because, actually, for the public, we've done a great job, because law and order is just not very high on their agenda anymore.
Yeah.
And so, actually, it is more difficult in that sense. But I think all we would ask in the service is that we get a fair hearing, that when something does go in the media, that actually it's portrayed in a way that actually is not helpful for us necessarily, but there's only ever the interest in the bit that's going to cause controversy.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not helpful for anybody. It doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help us educate the public about what some of the challenges
and I'm
are.
not here to apologise to my colleagues, but as you will appreciate, it's a busy marketplace this week.
Particularly
a
at the
very
moment,
busy marketplace. Right, where's Jane Cowell? Jane Cowell? Yes, thank you, Jane. If you just tell us who you are and pose your question, please. Jane's from the Metropolitan Police.
Good morning, Jane Cowell from Metropolitan Police. Not quite so strategic question. There is a growing shortage of detectives, not just within London, but across the UK. What does the panel think needs to happen to make a detective career pathway an attractive option again?
Thank you. Could I just remind, Jane, not by way of criticism, when you do speak, if you can stand up, it's helpful for the cameras to pick you out. Thank you very much. But OK, point taken. Who wants to answer that one? What about you, Sara?
I have heard it said, and other Chief Constable colleagues have made exactly the same comment, and have been concerned about some of whether the Windsor pay reforms, particularly around the 24-hour cover, had actually meant that there were pay deficits. Speaking from my own experience in Thames Valley, that wasn't so much of an issue, except for one particular point, and I think this is really key, that we were finding that detectives wanted to do some jobs, but there was a real issue about detectives wanting to go into public protection because of what they saw as the personal risk. And Nora, who headed up the unit for a long time, is nodding vigorously, because the workloads were enormous, because the risk was significant, a feeling that when tragedies did occur and there were IPCC investigations, that people felt hung out to dry. So there were lots of concerns. Maybe a lot were about perception, not reality, but that was an issue. So I think before I kind of accept a more general thing for the whole of the service, there are certainly issues about the pay and the rewards and the unintended consequences, I think, of the Windsor reforms. But the second issue, which I guess is a leadership issue for all of us, we keep talking about the fact that demand is changing. It is. We keep talking about the fact that, in the last 3 years, the number of child abuse investigations have increased by 88%. We need to be making sure not just that we've got adequate resources in those units, and we need to think about what we're going to do less of, if we're going to do more of, but also we need to make sure that there's the right sort of support around people and that they don't feel under the spotlight and that senior officers are not there with them. And so I think there's a leadership issue and there's maybe a resourcing issue.
Mike, what do you attribute this to? Is it just hard slog, long hours, little reward, too much paperwork, no thanks, not enough money, working longer for a smaller pension?
Nothing to add,
take your pick.
Nothing to add. It's, I think the only bit of your question, Jane, that I disagree with is you're saying that it's not a strategic question, because actually beneath the question that you've asked are two huge issues for the service that we are picking up and we will be reporting on in the near future. One is the whole issue of capability. For good reason, the service has had to focus and concentrate on capacity, numbers. Numbers have dominated because of the cuts in numbers, etc. But there is a far more complex question that needs to follow around capability, the ability that officers will require in the future to deal with demand. And that presupposes the second big issue, and that is the ability to forecast demand. And the ability of forces to forecast demand, as we sit here at the moment, is limited. Work has just been developed in the recent months around what current demand looks like, and that requires further development, let alone what lies beneath stones that are about to be turned over. So the issue of capability, I think, not just in terms of detectives and investigative capability, because I think that's one element of this, but what will it require to be a competent, efficient, effective police officer in 10 years' time? What will it require? What will a police force need in terms of the makeup of staff to deal with demand coming in? What new people will it need to bring into the service? What new skills will it need to bring into the service? How will it need to equip people differently? These are huge questions that require urgent attention.
You'll know this quote. I think it's Hugh Ord who says it from time to time. He says, yes, I know morale is at an all-time low. It's been at an all-time low since I joined the force in 1975. You know, I mean, is morale an issue? And am I being over-cynical when I use that quote?
Morale is, excuse me, morale is certainly an issue, but let's not dwell upon that, because let's not forget we work in a can-do environment. I want to echo what Sarah said about, and go back to the question, how do we make it a more attractive option? Well, we need to be fair to people. I talk to colleagues who are in child protection units with a quarter of the resources they had and a quadruple caseload. I talk to colleagues who are worried because they don't feel that they are able to actually deliver a reliable investigative service. That has a personal burden upon them, and a professional one too, because we hear regularly, going back to the issues around what gets in the press, when it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. People are worried that they can't deliver what the public require of them. You know, we talk about workplace stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. I've spoken to officers in tears because they work on the child protection unit and they're so worried about the caseload that they have. Yet they still go into work early, they still work on their rest days, they still do their best to make it work. I haven't got an answer to your question, Jane, about how we make it more attractive, because I really don't think we can at the moment. I think until we make sure that we have some proper resilience in the forces across England and Wales again, where if an officer is finding a case particularly arduous, that they know they've got a proper support network, occupational health resilience, proper line management, and there's no criticism of any individual here, by the way. But the bottom line is everybody is having to do far more with far less. And in those sorts of environments, and it's not just in detectives as well, this is right across the board, everybody I speak to is really worried about the way in which we continue to deliver policing, because when it goes wrong, let's be honest, it goes badly wrong.
Do you think, Alison, the general public have any awareness of this? Or do you think it possible that some people anyway would say, well, yeah, sorry for the coppers, but it's tough for all of us?
Well, I was going to say that very thing, in that I think probably the reality is exactly as you've said it, but I think everyone in the public sector, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that you're finding it so hard to get that public interest out there in being a detective. Isn't it the second best job in the world after perhaps being a journalist, in that, you know, you've got, you're out there, you're meeting people, you're doing incredible things, and I can assure you that in journalism now that the pay is atrocious, the conditions are appalling, the pension's dreadful. However, people go into journalism and perhaps being a detective for quite similar reasons. They enjoy meeting people, they want to try and do good, and they're prepared to work hard to achieve those aims. But I think, and that again, that's why do people write books and watch films about detectives? Because it's great stuff. Now, but there is a sort of more serious issue there. Why are you no longer able to get that message out there that being a detective can be exciting? No one's saying it's easy. The best jobs in life aren't easy. So what's gone wrong there? And coming back to that point in the press again, I think what gets into newspapers, it's very simple. What gets into newspapers is interesting stuff.
Yeah.
It's not facts, it's not figures, it's not reports, it's not you've done this, that and the other. It's when a detective has been out there and done something amazing. They're the stories that we want to run.
I just want to come back. I mean, we use the word detective like it's a badge. You know, in America it's a slightly different style, I guess. But most of the officers I talk to, whether they're in uniform or plain clothes, they want to detect crime. They don't want to report crime, they don't want to chase numbers. The frustration that people talk to me about is the fact that they jump running from job to job to job, reporting a crime. Well, whatever happened to us investigating? Because that's what a detective does, and that's what all police officers want to do. You want to find out what's happened, you want to bring the bad people to justice. That's what you want to do. You don't want to be chasing numbers and running from call to call to call and actually not giving the public an investigative service. We're not just there to collect crime reports, and that's the bottom line. People do want to do what you've said. People want to be detectives and investigate things, but they haven't got the time, resources or resilience now to do that.
Last word, Irene?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go right back to where Sarah started from, really. I think the PPU is now a big part of being a detective. So whilst local crime investigation used to be the biggest area because we focus very much on volume crime, we all know now that the big increasing area of our business is protecting people. And I think that's where the biggest risk sits. And we hear it regularly from our members about the risk that the difficulty they have recruiting, as Will says, because people are worried about what happens when something goes wrong. Because when something goes wrong in a PPU, it's a critical incident, and there's inquiries and everything else. And it's right that people should be held to account where things go wrong, but the risk-averse nature that we've now developed in the police service, and Nick Hardwick talked about this last night at the lecture, the risk-averse nature we've developed means that people are frightened to death to do things because they're worried about what might happen if it goes wrong. And there's a great example from, I don't know if he's still in this room, but one of our members was served notice for gross misconduct by the IPCC for not resourcing his PPU unit. Now, that guy is doing the best he possibly can with the resources he's got on a daily basis, managing huge risks. And what happens is somebody comes along and serves a notice on him because he's not resourcing his unit properly, something he has very little control over. So there's no wonder that people are really nervous about going into detective roles. And at our rank, there's quite often no choice about whether you become a detective. The last point I just want to make, and it's around the capability, is the role of the College of Policing in terms of defining career paths. And PIP is a great example of professionalising investigation. That is a great example of what actually we need to do right across the service. And whilst it's not working in terms of being attractive for detectives, I think we need to think very differently about how people's career will develop in the future, how they develop their own careers, what contribution they put into that, and what contribution the college puts into that as well.
OK, Irene, thanks very much indeed. Gideon Springer from the Metropolitan Police. Gideon, where are you? There he is. You pose your question, please.
Is this working?
Yeah, it's good.
My question is in relation to inspecting for equality and diversity. And the question is, when is the HMIC going to conduct inspections into equality and diversity policies and strategies in police forces, rather than simply focusing on numerical data? As what we know is that what gets measured gets done.
Yeah, just give me some background as to why you raised that concern, Gideon.
Raised the concern because there's quite a lot of work being done over the years in terms of equality and diversity, and I know that police forces do think that a lot of it's been done and we're now reaping the benefits. But I still think there are large areas, communities in the country who still feel that they're getting a disproportionate service from police services, and that leads into higher levels of crime in some societies, some of the counter-terrorism issues we've got now, and the reflection of the service that those individuals get. So my view is that to provide a proper service to all communities, we need to understand the policies and practices of forces.
Because there's not a sufficient mix of people, is that?
Well, I also think there's not a sufficient mix, and we talk about officers from BME backgrounds and other backgrounds not joining the police and not being progressed in police. And as we move forward to societies where 40% of our communities are from BME and other backgrounds, it's important that policing looks and feels like those communities, but also understands the needs of those communities to deliver proper policing.
And it's not doing so at the moment, in your opinion?
Not in my opinion.
All right, Mike, obviously one for you to kick off with.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It's a really important one. You'll know through Peel that the HMIC now conducts what we call rounded assessments of police forces, looking at efficiency, effectiveness and legitimacy. The question that you're asking is in the legitimacy part of that equation. And we are currently, just this week, begun the second part of our legitimacy inspections. That has come in two parts. The first part was a couple of months ago, and that was conjoined with efficiency inspection. And that was looking at, if you like, internal legitimacy. What does it feel like to be a member of X Shire? Do you have a voice? Is it fair? If you're complained about, do you get a fair hearing? If you've got a complaint, do you have a fair hearing? Those sorts of issues were looked at and will be reported on, and forces will be graded. The second part of a legitimacy, which is currently being inspected, is around external legitimacy, and that gets to the points around disproportionality, recruitment processes, how tuned in the force is to local communities, how the priorities of a force reflect those of local communities. It's the connectedness, if you like, between a particular police force and the community it serves, and we will be looking at all of that.
So it's being done, arguably a bit late in the day.
Well, you could say late in the day. You know, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago, isn't it? Second best time is now. The legitimacy inspection was trialled last year. It is in full flow this year, and we'll be looking at those issues. One more comment, though, and that is every single police force is undergoing its own change programme. We in HMIC are doing exactly the same, and a key element of that is looking at equality and diversity, both within HMIC, but also in terms of how we inspect. And so the points that have been made, I would agree with the exception of the fact that we look just at numerical issues. We don't. Inspections look much more at qualitative issues these days, and that is right that we do that.
Will?
Yeah, I mean, the equality and diversity question, I've used this word before, I'll use it again, trust. We talk about in the service or in the communities. Irene has commented in recent weeks, as have we, as have chief officers too, around the fact that with the shortfalls that we're experiencing, community policing is taking a massive hit. You know, I used the example the other day, you know, you may have 4 skills bases, that's 1 officer. That's not 4 people, and trying to get that message out there is important. So when somebody's taken for mutual aid somewhere else, that's not another person, that's 1 person who perhaps isn't delivering community policing. Coupled with the reduction in community policing teams, what that does is undermine the hard-earned and it's so easily lost trust that has been built up in communities. You know, let's not be naive here. A lot of the successes we've experienced in counter-terrorism have been because people are talking to people on the street. You know, if there is that trust, it builds the attractiveness for others to want to join the police. If people don't ever see an officer and don't have a relationship with the police, then how are you going to have people who actually get to understand and want to be part of a service which, you know, inherently they may not wish to be involved in? It's so difficult, but actually it all sits under the whole banner. If you take people out of communities, you create distance, you break down those relationships, and that, I think, is a major problem.
Although there is an argument, I've heard of vans that actually, you know, sort of just random sort of patrols, etc., don't actually lead to a reduction in crime. What works is targeting the worst areas, that 50% of crime is committed there.
Yeah, but you talk to communities and community leaders and community groups, and, you know, the frustration is the reduction in the community policing team because they have built relationships with people. They're talking to people. You know, it's the old adage of a police officer walking down the street at the end of the day, but actually it matters to people. And if we're really serious about, you know, going to comments from colleagues from the HMIC, you know, we're asking people what they want. Well, let's listen to the answers then, you know, because it's all about how you ask the questions to what answer you get. If people are saying things, we need to make sure we listen to it, capture that properly, and actually take that forward and put that into the mix when we look at how we actually deliver policing.
Do you think, Alison, that the police force of this country reflects the society it serves properly? Do you think it's important that we have people at the bobby on the beat more frequently than we have at the moment?
Well, it's massively important that if you're going to have any real legitimacy, you have to reflect the people that you're serving. We had a Freedom of Information request story that we did about a month or so ago about the number of officers from ethnic minorities in the different forces. Now, and there were some forces that were coming back which said there were none, to the point where I said to the reporter, well, this just can't be right. We just have to send it back and do it again. Now, but I mean, I guess that's because you've got some sort of rural forces, maybe where you're not going to be having to sort of reflect such so much a diverse community. But it's hugely important. And the other thing I would say, again, numbers don't tell stories, people tell stories, and you need those people out there showing what they're doing, if that's the message to get across.
Sara?
Let's talk about the issue of the way in which we don't represent the communities. I mean, in terms of gender, things have improved quite significantly. You know, over 30% of all officers, and in terms of senior ranks, it's beginning to look quite different. The college is doing some good work on minority ethnic representation, but we need to deliver on that. I mean, I think what's really good is we're for the first time saying, you know what, there is unconscious bias, and we need to address that. We all have all sorts of biases, and we need to deal with that. But I do think, however much we try and do the college work, unless there is some statutory movement, by which I mean go for an approach as they had in Northern Ireland, where you select on merit and appoint on representation, I don't see how it's ever going to change, given the way in which the population of the country is changing. However, the other problem we've got is that most forces aren't recruiting. So even if you've got a change in the law to say, actually, we could take the Northern Ireland approach, it's not about dropping standards, none of that nonsense. It's about saying, select on merit, appoint on representation. But actually, most forces aren't recruiting. And given the prospect on budgets, it looks unlikely they will be.
Gideon, do you want to come back on any of this?
Yeah, the responses are what we would know, but it's an intractable problem. We do need to do something about it, and it's not just about recruitment. It's about particularly my force, Metro Police, we've got quite a lot of members from diverse backgrounds, and it's about the fair treatment of those individuals and the fair progression of those individuals, so that it's reflected as an organisation that people want to work for. So we've talked a lot about ethics this conference, we've talked a lot about valuing difference. And it's just to make sure that we do value that difference and make the best of the resource we've got, both inside of the organisation and outside with communities.
Last word, Irene?
Gideon's great question focuses on policies and strategies. I'd actually take it further in terms of what HMIC need to look at, and that's around leadership and culture, because I think that's where the real difference will be made. And I know that the Peel Inspection does look at leadership, but in the context of equality and diversity or value in difference, the role of leaders and the culture that they set within the organisation makes a huge difference. And that links into what Gideon just mentioned around organisational justice. You know, if leaders create an environment where people feel valued, that they're treated fairly, actually they're then going to reflect that in the way that they deal with the public. And so it's not just the policies and strategies. You can have all the policies and strategies in the world. It's actually how you make it happen that matters. And I think that's the really key bit that HMIC need to look at.
OK. Where's Dave? Dave Snelling from the Metropolitan Police. Dave, your question, please, pal. Thank you. Alan? Dave?
Before I ask the question, just a quick plug. Sara left me with some brochures about the Jan Trust, so if anyone wants any, please come and collect them. Question I have is, Lord Bew stated that in a recent survey, 60% of those questioned stated that policing is not a major concern for them. Should we as police worry about this? And what would the panel advise us to do to raise the profile of policing?
It's arguable, Will, that the public are saying you're doing a great job, we've nothing to worry about. Theresa May's right, crime's coming down, the streets are safer than they have ever been or have been for ages and donkey's years. Why should we worry? Why should we be concerned about the police service? It's fantastic. Is it not?
I think it largely depends on how you record crime.
I was being provocative.
And the reliability of such reporting. What I think is interesting is that, it always challenged me years ago when we did like customer satisfaction surveys. What were we going to do? Ring someone up we arrested and say, how was it for you? Bad. This is the point. I think we have to listen to statistics, but often, they are not the be-all and end-all. We also know that, the police service is held in exceptionally high regard, only one below the clergy, for example. If people are broadly content in their communities, that's a good news story for police officers and for policing. And also another thing is you can't measure the success of prevention. So if people are... Is this a good figure or a bad figure? Because if people are content, that surely is a good thing. If it doesn't matter to people, that's the question for me. Why doesn't it matter? Is it because are they content with what's being delivered, or are they not?
I think there's a bit more behind this, if I'm right, David. When Lord Bew spoke yesterday, what he was saying was, I think, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, what he was saying was 60% of the public don't really care about your problems. It wasn't that they don't care about the police, it was they don't care about your problems. Is that right? Or was that right in saying?
I think that was the emphasis he was saying, that perhaps we're not in the forefront of people's concerns as perhaps we as police officers think we should be.
I think that was more to the point. So, Sara, your response to that?
Absolutely spot on. If you look at the Ipsos Mori surveys over the last 10 years, policing is now not in the top 10. Alison's point about it not being an issue in the last election is a point well made. I think there was one Friday when Jack Dromey tried to raise the debate about police numbers and it went absolutely nowhere. And I've said publicly before that we have elected a government which made no promises to protect spending in Home Office or in policing. And so as chiefs, I'm quite clear that 90% of our effort must be about how on earth do we manage with significantly lower budgets. So all the work we're doing on demand, on collaboration, on different ways of doing things, on the evidence base, on just saving money, on transformation, on contracting out this, that and the other, that's what we've got to focus. But there is, I think, the point that Laura made earlier on, there does need to be a debate with the public as well. But actually, the majority of our effort is we work in a democracy. We've elected a government that made no promises about spending on police. and that's the reality of it. And it reflects, I think, that lack of concern. Now, whether that is as a function of the fact we've been successful is a debatable point.
Mike?
When I was Chief Constable, I never received a letter from anybody saying, thank you very much, I wasn't burgled last night. Because there is an expectation from the public that they are safe. And I think that, and that's a reasonable expectation that people can have. The reality is, as Dave is suggesting, community safety as opposed to policing is not keeping ministers awake at night. And that will be reflected in how money is allocated. I think that is, there is a clear mantra, political mantra, that I think everyone in this room will have heard, and no doubt disputed, that crime is down, money has come out, crime is down, equals more money can come out. The challenge, I think, for the service is that, and I speak as somebody who was in the service not that long ago in a leadership role, is there is not yet a compelling counter-narrative from the service to deal with that mantra. It is being worked up, it's being developed, but it needs to accelerate. So I think it is an issue. I think community safety is probably a measure of the success of the service in many ways, that people are not. It is not top of the pops. It is not competing with immigration in the public agenda, with health, with a number of other issues. So I think there is a cause for concern, and the service needs, I think, to work on the narrative of what it is concerned about.
Alison?
Well, I'd be terrified if that was me, the people were making those, because if you put yourself in a politician's shoes, 60% of people, they're not bothered either way. Right, okay, take another chunk out of there. They've got to find the cuts, and they're not going to take it out of health or things like that, which the country is going to go mad about. But then, interestingly, the last speakers that you've had have been talking about radicalisation. There can be no bigger topic in the country. It ties in entirely with the whole refugee issue that we're now looking now. Why in the police's role, that should be at the forefront of people's concerns. And that's an argument you need to be getting out there making. Otherwise, they're just going to keep chipping away at you year after year, and people won't miss you till you're gone, like Woolworths and things like that.
Irene?
It's a really valid point around the terrorism. The thing around the terrorism debate is the majority of the public, the vast majority of the public, think it will never affect them. What they don't know is what's going on in the background and all the work that's going on in the background to keep them safe. So this perception that actually policing doesn't worry me, even if you interpret it as a positive, that actually I have no concerns, I feel safe, I live in a nice environment, therefore you can take money out of policing. It goes back to Ian's question of the Home Secretary this morning. Actually, how far do you cut before you know when actually that role of keeping people safe behind closed doors actually falls? And do we have to wait until there's another tragedy before we say, we've got to that point now? Actually, that's been too much. I just think that I think we should celebrate a little bit success, because I actually think the way I interpreted it when Lord Bew said it, and I went to the launch of the actual document, was that actually this is a good thing in that community safety is off the agenda. When I was a BCU commander, it was the top of every single local meeting was about police and community safety. It's not anymore, and there's some good stuff in that. But I think we also have to recognise that crime and recorded crime is not a measure of police success. Keeping people safe is a measure of police success, and that's not just measured by recorded crime.
OK, thank you very much. Gary Buttercase from the Met.
My question is mainly directed towards Sara. With all the austerity cuts, what most of the forces around the country have done is they've looked at the rank mix and tried to make the rank mix proportionate. And we saw figures the other day whereby constables reduced by 10%, and we'd all accept that because that's the front line and that's the engagement with the communities. You then go to the top line and it's 10% of ACPO have been reduced, and the next line down you go to 23%. When do you think, bearing in mind we've got legislation which allows us to have a chief, the Home Secretary was put earlier the question with regards to the perversity of having 5 PCCs, 5 chiefs, 5 deputies. When are ACPO MPCC going to share some of the burden and reduce their numbers proportionately to the rest of us and show some visible leadership so we can look up to see reductions in...
The 23-25% you refer to as superintendents?
Superintendents and chief superintendents, yes.
Yeah. So when are we going to play on an even playing field, Sara?
You heard the Home Secretary repeat our very clear line on amalgamations. And in fact, the situation has got worse in the last 10 years because the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act says that each force will have a chief, a deputy and an assistant chief. I had a debate with an official only yesterday saying we would definitely save money if we could move on this. And, you know, even a kind of a slight move away from that provision, which of course never existed before, just to give us a bit more scope. I don't think there'll be much change there. So I think one of the main issues is actually this desire to retain the 43. And I said at the beginning, I understand politically the attraction of that, but it, without a shadow of a doubt, does create cost. And I find it very difficult. Somebody said, was it yesterday, you know, how can we cut operational roles when we're not cutting some of these leadership roles? I had a debate with one of my colleagues, and you know, I try very hard to represent the 43 forces because I've got a kind of a broad range there. But I said to a chief of a force which is smaller, and he was saying to me, but we have got to have a force for our county. And I said, how many people live in your county? He said the number. I said, well, more than that live in Oxfordshire. And I don't think the public of Oxfordshire was suffering at all because they were being policed by Thames Valley, which included Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. So I kind of think the desire to cling to the small county forces is causing us a difficulty, but there's going to be no movement there. So we've got to go for the laying. So I think we're very much constrained by that legislation. Beyond that, as you say, there have been reductions in the number of posts, 10%, not as much as in the superintendent ranks, I fully accept.
Doesn't read well, does it, Mike, if you're at the bottom of the food chain?
No, and I think there's not much to add to what Sara has said. Just one thought, really, and it goes back to the point I was making before about cohesive leadership throughout the service. Because, again, implicit in the question, it's not a criticism of the question, it's a very valid and important question, and I think Sara's answered it. But implicit in the question is there are nearly different elements of policing within the leadership. And I think the more important question is, what does it take to lead a particular police force? And what is needed across all the levels of leadership, rather than to say how many chief officers do we need, how many chief superintendents, how many sergeants. I think there is a more rounded question. The important bit behind that is that it is this divide and conquer mentality that can be out there, where there is a perspective from the Superintendents Association, a perspective from the Chiefs Council, a perspective from the Federation, sometimes which are bumping up against each other. At times that can be healthy internal tension, at other times that can play into the hands of people who want to compete against policing.
Do you accept, Will, that, as Sara's indicated, that you're stuck with it?
It's an interesting point. In divide and conquer, unite and succeed, perhaps. You know, legislation is there, but let's be honest, we've seen in recent times that can be changed. I support entirely, I think your example is one I'm definitely going to use, about the Thames Valley, because how can it be right that you've got a force with perhaps less officers in it than one borough has got in the Metropolitan? The 43 force model, you know, we've got to really be careful here about self-interest and, you know, compartmentalising things because that's the way we've always done it. We can't live in that world anymore because things have changed. And I think those who are resistant to change need to probably take a look at themselves, because actually, you know, if we can deliver, and we've seen it work, Thames Valley and other forces that are collaborating, it's about making sure that we can deliver policing. It doesn't necessarily matter if you've got the county badge on the side of the vehicle or not, and we've seen that happening elsewhere. I'm not saying it's a panacea that everything's all right under collaboration, because we know it isn't, but we need to think a lot more radically, as we've all said recently, about how we deliver policing, and that is one of the major key issues.
Do you see any sense, Alison, in 43 police forces with 43 different bosses on big money, and in many cases offering a slightly different police service to the one next door?
I think all organisations that want to survive and certainly thrive have to adapt. And if you're dealing with human beings, you need to adapt very quickly.
Right. Irene, good point.
Yeah, I mean, my views on the 43-4 structure are quite clear, although I do keep getting misreported saying I'm in support of mergers, which I'm not. I actually just think we need to think radically different about how we deliver policing. And I think the work that was done by the National Debate Advisory Group that Sara and I were both involved with was really important in terms of thinking differently. And yes, we are at the moment constrained by that legislation about having 43 chiefs, and people use the argument of localism for not merging forces. I actually think it's just about how we layer, starting from local policing services, all the capabilities that we deliver, the functions we deliver at different levels. And as an example, and no disrespect to colleagues from Warwickshire and West Mercia in the room, but if you take that as an example, Warwickshire is smaller than about, well, put it this way, there are some of our members who are commanding areas that are far larger than Warwickshire as a police force. Warwickshire can remain a police force. Why does it need a chief constable in charge of it? Why can't a chief superintendent be in charge of what is effectively Warwickshire's local policing delivery, with a chief constable sitting somewhere else that has responsibility for a whole range of things? And I just think we need to think differently about how we might deliver policing. The problem we've got at the moment is all the solutions that we're coming up with around collaboration, etc. It's as I said this morning, I think they're all short-term fixes. I think if we're looking 5, 10 years ahead, we're going to have to unpick everything that we're doing now, because we're going to have to think really differently about how we deliver policing.
OK, thanks very much. Do you want to move on? Gillian Murray from BTP. Gillian has got a question about IPCC investigations. Thanks, Gillian.
Afternoon. My question is quite rightly about IPCC investigations. We've got a number of cases currently where our officers are suffering because of those very long, protracted investigations, and certainly the evidence that we found is due to the investigation ability of some of the officers the IPCC are using, and perhaps their risk-averse attitude to who they employ to do those investigations. And my question to the panel is, what do you see the future of the IPCC? And do you believe that they are employing the right level of investigators? Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Mike, do you share Gillian's concerns?
What is self-evident is the premise behind the question, and that is investigations are taking too long. I have personal experience of this, of an investigation which was riven throughout a particular police force for years and years, involving so many people, and it moved at a glacial pace. So I think there is something absolutely right about the question. I don't know whether that's down to the competence of people, but I think the review of the IPCC is the right thing to do. It needs people who can investigate in sometimes serious crime, sometimes have the experience and the training to deal with complex criminality or complex misconduct. And I absolutely think that going forward, the IPCC has to be fit for purpose. It's actually in the interest of the service to have a strong, capable, competent investigating body who are standing away from the service investigating it. That's good for public confidence, which means it's good for policing. So in terms of reviewing the IPCC, looking forward and developing it, absolutely right. Something has to change. That's obvious, because the complaint investigations take far too long.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, Sara, have done interviews with coppers who've just given up. I mean, they've been on guarding leave for two years while the case has been investigated, and at the end of the day, they just said, I've had enough of this, and they've left the force. I mean, I know rigorous investigations have to take place to satisfy everyone, not least the public, but some of them take forever, don't they?
No, and by the way, because of the changes to the rules earlier this year, if they're under investigation for anything very serious, they can't leave anymore. So that's not even an option that's open to people, and that's another story. Yeah. I mean, I agree completely that the investigations take far too long. We had one in Wickham, was it 7 years it took, Ed? And the officers were all acquitted a few months ago. And the problem is, it's not just the officers who have that hanging over them for that length of time. It's about the impact on family, it's on the impact on the community. So absolutely agree with the point made. In terms of the solution, when I was a chief, I used to raise this every time the Commissioner came to speak to us, and I would get a response. And now, in my new role, I have raised with Anne Hours on several occasions. She is seized of the issue, but I don't think we'll see it change very quickly. That said, they are doing some things. You might have noticed they've just been advertising for a chief operating officer. They've advertised for a head of serious investigations. They have grown really quickly. They've had extra money. Any of you who've been in an organisation which has grown rapidly, it does kind of stress out the system. So there is a lot of stuff, management stuff, that she is doing. She has also submitted proposals to the Home Office about the IPCC being structured quite differently and trying to streamline some of the decision making. So there is a response from the IPCC. I think we need to keep the pressure on, because the other thing is not only does it blight people, all sorts of people's lives, it also costs so much. The longer these things go on, frankly, the only people who win are the lawyers.
Okay. Quick word from you, Will, and I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. Will? Yeah,
I'll be really brief. I mean, the Taylor reforms were about remedial and not punitive outcomes. I think we need to remember that. I agree entirely with your point about things need to be expedited, because if things are dealt with quickly and reliably and stand scrutiny, then that benefits everybody, the officers, the complainants, the case itself, and that will help build public confidence. I don't know, there's no quick win answer, but I think we should remind ourselves of the fact that why we actually arrived at the IPCC in the first place. It was about trying to make things better and deal with complaints in a more reliable and expeditious way.
Let me call up, if I can, Keith Gillett from West Yorkshire. Keith Gillett with us? Keith? Right there, so you can just get a mic to Keith if you could. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My question really is around scrutiny and inspection. Forces everywhere, I think, are experiencing an increasing level of scrutiny and inspection from both the HMIC and other agencies that are working in similar areas. And this is bringing significant burdens in terms of both preparation and participation for senior operational leaders. I'd be interested to know what panel think the HMIC in particular could do to maximise the opportunities to collaborate with other inspection regimes in order to both reduce costs, maximise efficiencies, but perhaps more importantly, give the public confidence that public services across the piece are working together in their best interest.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Mike, do you want to give that one?
I'll give you a personal view on this. It is not HMIC as a body don't have a line on this, but let me tell you where I stand. I think you're on the money. I think that there is, maybe for a slightly different reason, I can't think of any sustainable community safety initiative that is delivered by one agency. We all know that partnership, multi-agency delivery, call it what you will, is mainstream activity now. It is not something that sits in the margins of policing. And so when we inspect outcomes, I think it is going to be increasingly difficult for us to inspect single agency contribution to that. As it stands at the moment, by statute, we have only a responsibility for inspecting the police. That's law. And that is the scale of our remit. We do joint inspection activity with other inspection bodies, Ofsted in particular, and around social services and child protection. I see that as a growth area for us. There's a huge amount of joint inspection activity. I've no doubt you're aware of a lot of it. But I see crystal ball gazing in the future. I see that likely to be more of that. Whether that becomes like a formal collaboration between different inspecting bodies, because I think there will always be a point that the profession of policing will justify, I think, because of the powers and the responsibilities that the police have, its own inspecting body in the same way that I think health should have. But in terms of bringing them together to have a more cohesive inspection regime, I agree.
Irene.
Not at all. I mean, from what I said this morning in my speech, we've got to think differently about how public services generally are organised. And as Mike says, so much of our work touches on other agencies. I will just say actually at this point, and I probably should have pushed back on the Home Secretary this morning on this, there seems to be this obsession with collaborating with blue light services. yes, we have some things in common, more around infrastructure and support functions. But actually, if we're going to collaborate with anybody, let's collaborate with other public services, because they're the ones who we deliver our services with. And that, for me, is where the inspection should sit, just as Mike says, really. So I would fully support. When the government realises that my idea is a good one and decide to go down that route, then they can restructure the inspections to match it.
Could I just ask for a brief response from the three remaining members of our panel, because we're running out of time. Alison, first of all.
On the inspections,
yeah.
I think that the increase generally in society in inspection is an interesting thing. I mean, it never really used to sort of exist in this way. And then, of course, every time there's an inspection, then it makes it into the press. There's obviously a sense that it's just another thing to be kicked with. So my point would be, in those periods between the inspections, that's when you need to be getting your good messages out.
Yeah. Well,
I just want to speak in support of what Irene just said about the way in which, you know, one size doesn't fit all. We need to look at the way in which we work in partnership with key stakeholders, and not keep wondering about this sensational idea about having a police officer, firefighter and a paramedic in a car together, which is just frankly nonsense.
Very brief.
Just a really brief point on what Alison has just said. I am just reviewing at the moment 43 individual force reports about efficiency. There's some tricky news for some forces in there, but there's loads of good news as well. Let's see what hits the press.
Well, on that point, I mean, you're quite right, because there is good news. I mean, think what stories you enjoy reading yourself. It's always very easy to kick the press. But then you think, okay, what do I actually want to read when I pick up a paper? Or what stories are interesting? Even down to the most basic form of news. When you talk to your neighbour over the garden fence, do they say everybody in my family is absolutely fine and well and everyone's healthy and the kids doing well? Or do they say such a body's just run off with the next door neighbour and so is poorly? That tragically is the very form of news, and always has been. Use it, though, so when you have got something that's interesting and good, that's when you use it.
Generally speaking, it's something that happened today that didn't happen yesterday. Sara.
Of course, HMIC need to work with other inspectorates to reflect the amount of collaborative work that goes on. HMIC has also had a massive increase in its budget. It therefore has got lots more inspectors. Therefore, they make more demands on forces. I think you need to manage your impact very carefully, both in terms of the data you require, but the endless focus groups that we have to provide for endless. I mean, in Thames Valley, in the end, we had an office at headquarters, which was the HMIC office, which reflected the amount of time they were spending with us. So you need to manage the impact. There is something they have just done, though, which I think is good. I think there's several thousand extant HMIC recommendations on forces, which is just ridiculous. And I know that the organisation has taken steps to cull a lot of those, to streamline them, and they are going to be much more considered and careful with their recommendations, which I think is important. And the other good thing, to be fair to HMIC, is I do think that Peel is a lot better than having all these kind of haphazard inspections which tended to follow bad news. At least Peel is a rounded view which can help inform the public and actually, as Mike said, more often than not, reflect a really good picture of the service.
I've overrun our time. Thank you very much. I'm sure you'd like to show your appreciation to the panel. Thank you very much.